Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargava, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. Back in 2017, the government had launched a new scheme to improve the state of higher education in the country. This was the Institution of Eminence scheme. And one of the main reasons for this was that Indian institutes were not featuring in the top global university rankings.
So, Indian institutions still don't do as well as, say, their counterparts, say, even in China or Singapore, do in world rankings.
That's Ritika Chopra, Indian Express's national education editor.
But, around 2010-15, Indian government and institutions particularly were facing a lot of criticism with regard to their performance in global ranking scales. So there's QS World Ranking, the Times Higher Education World Rankings, and Indian institutions, for the longest time, there were barely any even in the top 300, very few. And there were none in the top 250. So the Indian government, specifically because a lot of our top institutions are government centrally run institutions, were at the receiving end of a lot of flack every year, every time a new edition of rankings was released.
And this criticism really bothered the government.
And this is around the time, if you remember, even the PISA rankings, which was essentially ranked your school education. This is run by the OECD. So India exactly wasn't doing really well as far as rankings of school education is concerned or rankings of higher education is concerned. So year after year, we were not doing well. And eventually this also entered the mainstream discourse because I remember President Pranab Mukherjee at one point also highlighted that.
Right now, when I am speaking before you, there are more than 763 universities, state and central. There are more than 38,000 colleges, degree colleges. And there are scores of technical institutions. But I was dismayed to find out that most of these institutions do not come in any reckoning in the rating of the international rating agencies. And I harp you on this point.
That's when it also really picked up because when the president of the country, while speaking with heads of educational institutions, higher education institutions, brings it up, that it is worrying and that our education institutions are not doing well internationally, at least are not perceived to be doing as well compared to the other counterparts. That's when it actually entered the mainstream discourse. And I must say, initially, every time the government faced criticism, they did respond by being a little dismissive of rankings. I personally also have my problems because these rankings tend to focus on, say 4 or 5 parameters. And education, is way more complicated than that. It's just not 4 or 5 things can define globally whether you are educating students well. But they were initially very dismissive. Then they tried responding by coming up with their own edition of rankings, which is now the National Institute Ranking Framework. But eventually they did relent to that criticism. I don't know if I could call it pressure. And they said, okay, you know what? We are going to focus on a few select institutions, help and support them in every possible way. And eventually, or rather, hopefully all of that will help them improve their performance in world rankings.
And this is what led to the Institution of Eminence scheme, or IOE. The idea was that the government would back 20 institutions, 10 public and 10 private, and give them the Institution of Eminence tag.
ये जो यूनिवर्सिटी टॉप 10 आएगी 20 टोटल, उनको सरकार के नियमों बंधनों से मुक्त करके एक स्वतंत्रता दी जाएगी. उनको जिस दिशा में जैसे आगे बढ़ना है बढ़ने के लिए अवसर दिया जाएगा. और इस काम के लिए 5 साल के भीतर इन यूनिवर्सिटीज को 10,000 करोड़ रुपए 10,000 करोड़ रुपया दिया जाएगा.
Ritika says that the government was basically promising 2 things, money and autonomy. Though the money was only meant for the 10 public institutions, the private ones were supposed to get more control over how they ran their institutes and administration.
Because as we all know, of course, the higher education regulators have earned a pretty bad rep because of this, that, they tend to be more controlling and they don't give the kind of freedoms that institutions need. There is a lot of focus on meeting certain land parameters or ensuring that, there is an outline of a curriculum available and every institution should ideally subscribe to that curriculum. So it's perceived to be very restrictive, and through this scheme, the government was offering a less restrictive environment, which they hoped will help these 20 institutions to grow.
It has now been 5 years since the scheme was launched, and Ritika wanted to find out what exactly happened to it. So she embarked on a 2-month-long investigation, in which she reviewed official records, visited campuses across the country, and interviewed several university and government officials to find out the state of the scheme. And in this episode, that's what we'll be talking to her about. And she begins by telling us about the most glaring finding of the investigation.
So the most glaring bit was that the government had not managed to even sort of achieve the basics of the scheme. Here, of course, the basics being that they had selected 20 for the status. And I think roughly by the end of 2019, they had selected all 20 institutions, but they haven't been able to notify all 20.
And by notifying, she means actually giving them the tag of an Institution of Eminence.
So it's one thing to just announce somebody, rather just to make an announcement saying that you've been selected for a certain award, but it's another to actually organize a ceremony and hand over that trophy, right? So the handing over the trophy, really, if I could call it that, hasn't really happened. So only 12 to date have been notified, or rather can be officially called as Institutions of Eminence. There are 8 which are still in the pipeline, largely because of just red tape on the government's part. Some of the things are just inexplicable. That's the only way you can explain it, that it's just bureaucratic red tape, which is holding these institutions or notifications back. And there are a few other teething issues as well, but largely that. So that was the main sort of something that, the elephant in the room, that, you haven't managed to even get this scheme properly off the ground because you had to notify all 20. How else would you expect them to achieve their goals without officially notifying them as IOEs?
Now, out of the 8 that have still not been notified, 2 of them are in the public sector, while all the others are in the private sector.
Coincidentally, the 2 that are left in the public sector, Anna University, Jadavpur University, are universities located in opposition ruled states. They are state universities, and there's been a lot of back and forth between the center and state on who would fund what. And it's kind of their status or notification of the status is caught up in that tussle and hasn't really come through.
And Ritika says that for these private places, which form the majority of the institutes that have not got the IOE tag, there is absolutely no indication from the government about when that might happen.
In fact, based on my conversations with these private institutions, initially they did quite enthusiastically follow this up with the government. But we are at a point where they've virtually given up. There are officers of Amrita, VIT who said that, we don't know when it's going to happen, but we are trying our best to pursue those goals that we laid out anyway, with or without the IOE tag. But these are 4 or 5 institutions which have kind of given up hope and thinking of a plan B. What else? Is there anything else that they can do? Yes, but there is a divide that one can see between public and private institutions, because even among those who've got the status, the 4 private institutions that have got the status and the 8 public institutions that have been notified as IOEs, there is this huge divide because the public institutions seem to be doing better because of the money that they're getting under the scheme. That is something that, to be fair to the government, was never promised to the private institutions right from the beginning. But the government hasn't managed to even give them what they were promised, which is that we would give you more autonomy.
And she says that this is because Indian higher education is not regulated by just one body. For example, apart from the University Grants Commission, the main higher education regulator, there is also the Medical Commission, the Nursing Council, the Bar Council, and even the Architecture Council of India. So if you're an institute, then you have to deal with all these regulators.
And a lot of universities are multidisciplinary in nature. Manipal, for instance, if I can take that example, that is one of the 4 private institutions that have got the status. They run a very big medical school. So they have to actually deal with the medical commission on a regular basis. So what happens is that sort of creates some kind of dichotomy. It's a little schizophrenic because you have freedom to run programs, or rather freedom to maybe even start new programs as far as UGC is concerned. But when it comes to medical education, you would have to follow every rule that the NMC lays down. So you don't have autonomy as far as your medical programs are concerned, but maybe you have autonomy as far as your, humanities programs are concerned. So as far as autonomy was concerned, they don't have absolute freedom because there is significant relief from one body, while there are 15 other bodies which are, constantly raising demands of compliance.
For example, recently, the University Grants Commission wrote a letter to all institutions, including those with the IOE tag, asking them to rename certain departments. So technically, the institutions which were supposed to get sweeping autonomy under the scheme are not even being able to choose department names on their own. Now, after private institutions got this letter, some of them wrote back to the UGC.
So saying that, because they wrote back to UGC saying that I already have this department, which was a sponsored research cell. But then UGC wrote back to them asking them to rename the department. And this is something Jindal, Manipal University, even BITS also faced to some extent. So which honestly kind of seems silly because you've promised sweeping autonomy. And here you have these institutions sort of still bogged down by letter writing back and forth over something as trivial as what your department should be called. Now, UGC may turn around and say that maybe it was a junior level officer who did it, but, the institutions are saying then why can't you have a separate secretariat which only deals with us? Why do we have to consistently explain ourselves, consistently reiterate our eminent status why do we have to remind UGC of it?
Now, during her conversations with private institutions, she asked them about how they expected the scheme to help them. And they told her about why they found the whole prospect attractive.
During my reporting, I kept asking the private institutions, look, you don't get money. And if you're private, then you are set up by a state act. And I frankly don't even know if they need the kind of money because a lot of these private institutions are backed by big promoters. So I did ask them this question that how have you benefited from this? Or rather, what were you expecting? So one answer that I heard is that, of course, it will help improve our perception because globally we would be known as one of those top 20 institutions of the country. And a lot of the global rankings give a considerable amount of weightage to your perception. That, surprisingly to me, the improvement in perception that they felt would happen with the IOE tag was actually a big factor.
And as far as autonomy is concerned, she says that the institutes with the IOE tag do get some advantages, like deciding what the duration of a program should be.
So that I also remember was a huge sticking point between the ministry and the Prime Minister's office at the time they were drafting the regulation because the ministry was of the view that this is just too much freedom, And PMO was like, no, let them decide the duration of the program. But something which may sound very basic to you and me, which is the duration of a program, is actually mandated by the University Grants Commission. But as in IOE, a private university would be able to define duration of its program. For instance, say a master's program. At least this is much before the new education policy came in, but a master's program didn't necessarily have to be of 2 years. It could have been less than that. So an IOE had that kind of, or at least was promised that kind of flexibility. To give you one example. So any degree of relief from a regulator and an improvement in perception, these were two major factors which acted as a strong incentive for private institutions to apply for this tag. Because frankly, outside of that, they weren't entitled to any money.
Now, in Ritika's investigation, another glaring example was that of the Reliance Foundation's Jio Institute, which was the only institute selected for the scheme under the Greenfield category.
Actually, there were two applications that were selected in the Greenfield category. There was Bharti Foundation and Reliance Foundation's Jio Institute. Bharti eventually pulled out because they could not acquire the land that they were hoping to. So when I say the Greenfield category, it was a category under which a non-existent institution, an absolutely brand new institution, frankly just a plan, could be deemed eminent if the government appointed committee chose or selected that plan with There wasn't a lot of discussion on this when the CIE regulations were notified, but yes, there was a spotlight on this provision of the regulations right after Jio Institute's selection. There was this huge controversy. The government came under a lot of criticism, was accused of crony capitalism because it was Reliance Foundation, and everyone frankly questioned this, that how could you award the status to an institution that doesn't even exist? What about others which have been around for decades and have had some track record?
जियो इंस्टीट्यूट के खुलने से पहले ही उसे इंस्टीट्यूशंस ऑफ एमिनेंस यानी कि उत्कृष्ट संस्थान की लिस्ट में शामिल करने को लेकर विवाद हो गया है.
A non-existent educational institute which has not even started, not even the construction, has found a place among the coveted list of institutions of eminence, triggering a major controversy.
अगर हमारा पैसा जिससे ये हमें दिल्ली यूनिवर्सिटी को दे सकते थे, JNU को दे सकते थे, जो पब्लिक यूनिवर्सिटीज है, बट कहा कि ऐसा ख्याली इंस्टीट्यूट, ऐसा ख्याली पला बनाते हैं और हम लोग उनको इंस्टीट्यूट ऑफ एमिनेंस कहते हैं, 1000 करोड़ रुपया देते हैं और कहते हैं कि वाह भाई वाह, क्योंकि आगे चुनाव आने वाला है. हमको भी मालूम है कि अडानी, अंबानी, ये बड़े बड़े बिजनेसमैन किसके यार हैं, किसके साथ दोस्ती लगाते हैं और किस लिए ये इंस्टीट्यूट खोला गया. बुलेट ट्रेन बनी नहीं आपसे, वो भी एक ख्याली पलाव था.
So right after Jio's announcement, we had in fact done a 4-part series highlighting how this clause actually came into being, and that there were in fact concerns even internally within the government, within different departments of the government, on whether it was justified to just deem a plan of an institution as eminent. So I was frankly just curious, and at that point, of course, the government had put up a very strong defense. You know, a lot of it they said it wasn't our decision, it was a decision of an empowered committee made of experts. But yes, as a journalist, I was curious. I mean, because like I said, that my motivation is to stay with the story that 5 years down the line, what really happened to Jio. And Jio is one of the campuses that we had visited. And the issue there is that Jio is actually one of those 4 institutions which have had all their clearances from the government, from its expert committee, and for some inexplicable reason has not been notified.
So apart from Jio, it's the Kalinga Institute of Industrial Technology, Vellore Institute of Technology, and Amrita Vishwa Vidyapitham.
These are the 4. I mean, I don't want to get into the technicalities of it, but essentially their proposal was greenlit. By government standard, they had done everything that they had to prove that they're ready to become IOEs. But for the last 2.5 years, their official notification has been held up because of a committee that the government has not notified again. But what that means on the ground for an institution like Jio is that they have a campus in Navi Mumbai. They've got 2 9-story buildings. You walk through the campus, it's really eerily empty. It's like a white elephant. There are just about, I think, 120 students currently studying 2 postgraduate programs. And for me, I think the ironic part was that for an institution that the government was defending so much, and which a government panel or a panel of experts felt had the potential to become world class, is currently functioning as an AICTE-approved standalone institute. So it is in fact following all the regulations that any standalone institution in the country has to follow.
And yet, despite all this, despite Jio renovating its campus, making the necessary changes, a 9-member expert panel examining these changes, it still does not have the Institution of Eminence tag.
And which is what officials there unofficially told us, that's the reason why they haven't been able to start with a bang yet, because they felt that the tag was part of their birth plan. One can always debate whether that should have happened or not in the first place, but 5 years later, it hasn't come through, and they're operating at a much smaller scale than what their mandate was.
Now the question is, what happens if Jio does not get this tag, which it was promised right at its inception?
So that's a question, of course, I asked them, that do you have a plan B? So if the birth plan is not working out, so what are you going to do now? They were very tight-lipped about it. Of course, we'd sent them a questionnaire officially as well. I did speak with their provost, and his response was, look, we'll cross the bridge when we come to it. So they are very tight-lipped about what's going to happen if the status doesn't come through. I'm guessing they would just sort of go ahead. I don't know, maybe become a university, a state university at some point, but I don't have any clarity on what their plan B is, because on the face of it, it seems like they are still hopeful of getting the tag. and that maybe they haven't factored in any other recourse at this point. But no, I don't really have a clear answer to it, because when I've repeatedly asked them that question, they said we'll cross the bridge when we come to it.
So when it comes to private institutes, some have not got the tag because of bureaucratic red tape, and those who have got the tag have not received the autonomy that they were promised.
It seems that message has not percolated down through all the levels of bureaucracy, or in fact even across departments. You can't be an institution of eminence just for a ministry of the government, right? There are institutions which are even run by the INB ministry, right? And there are institutions which are running science programs for which they need funding from other departments. So of course, if the government needs to understand when you say autonomy, it can't be freedom from a department of government or of one wing of the government. It has to be autonomy in the true sense. Like I said, even within the education ministry, it doesn't seem, education ministry or the UGC for that matter, the message hasn't percolated. Why else would UGC, for instance, write a letter, asking them to set up certain cells and insist that it's called something? I mean, we asked this question to the UGC chairperson also. They said that, just because we are reminding them of something, it shouldn't be perceived as interference. So, for whatever reason right now, I mean, I don't think the bureaucrat or the officer in a regulator or in the ministry has been able to understand what autonomy really means. Or maybe it's really difficult for them to let go of that control.
What this means is that they might still be stuck in their old ways and would be dealing with these IOE institutes just like any other institute.
I mean, you can see that tussle even today between the IIMs and the ministry, why the Act is very categorical in terms of the freedoms that the IIM Act has. It hands over everything, virtually all kind of control to the IIMs. But even then, you can see that struggle within the ministry, within the bureaucracy, where they, for whatever reason, if they've sent across an order or a direction, and if it doesn't get followed like it used to earlier, there is a lot of discomfort with that. So I frankly don't have an answer to the question of whether this will change over a period of time, but what I do know is that hasn't happened. All I'm trying to say is that the autonomy is not freedom in the true sense of it. There are still these niggling factors, this back and forth, the compliances, which I think the private institutions thought that were expecting some relief from that, and that hasn't really happened. Frankly, I think at some level, like BITS Pilani, for instance, they feel that they are as good as any IIT in the country. So if an IIT is set up by an act and doesn't really have to hear from UGC on different aspects, why should a BITS Pilani, despite its IOE status, still receive letters from a UGC and, asking them whether, they've done X, Y, whatever?
In fact, it's worth noting that last year, an order by the UGC led to 300 vacancies in BITS Pilani, which, again, is an IOE institute.
So if you remember, UGC had issued this directive. I think they issued it last year and the year before that also. A lot of it was on account of the COVID-19 pandemic and the fact that the whole academic calendar was disrupted. And, because of that, UGC wanted institutions to refund fee of students who have cancelled their admission up to the 31st of October. The IOEs told us specifically that we are promised freedom as far as determining our fee and admission process is concerned. B, a lot of us have their own entrance tests. We have our own admission process. So we don't necessarily follow the calendar, say, like the engineering JEE Main or JEE Advanced cycle. And if a student has studied with us from July to October, and if I have to then refund that fee, it means that that seat is vacant and I can't technically fill that up for the next 4 years.
And BITS Pilani even wrote back to the government and emphasized on its IOE status, but the government did not relent. And so this resulted in the university having 300 vacancies.
We asked this question to the UGC chairperson as well. He said that, look, institutions have a social responsibility. IOE tag or no IOE tag, you have to meet that. So I will keep reminding them of their social responsibility, and my interventions, quote unquote, are in the best interest. We also, again, asked them, what about then the seats that fell vacant, which any other deserving student could have got. To that, I don't think that the answer was very convincing, but that they said that now we have a lateral entry system and we have credit banks and students can enter laterally, so they could have maybe filled up those seats, or they still can in the second or third year.
Now, so far we have only talked about private institutes and how they have and have not received the IOE tag. But now let's take a look at the public institutes, because they were the ones who were supposed to receive funding along with the autonomy, which Ritika says was a huge incentive for them to apply for this scheme.
Because a lot of these well-known government institutions are really old legacy institutions, which are especially in need of money to improve and renovate their infrastructure, So money, yes, of course, was a huge factor for the government institutions to apply.
In fact, she says that this is something that the private institutes wanted as well, but could not get that under the scheme.
That is something that I also realized during my conversations with private institutions. They're a little resentful of it, that हमें autonomy मिल रही है, लेकिन, we wish we had that kind of money too. This is something when I was going through minutes of several EC meetings also, I realized that the private institutions kept raising is that it would be great if we also had access to some of this funding, which the government hasn't relented to that. But like I said, to be fair to them, that was the deal anyway.
And Ritika says that the funding really has helped these public institutes, especially in terms of their infrastructure.
We need to remember that in the last 4 years, ever since the introduction of also the EWS quota, everyone's had to increase their overall student strength by 25%, which meant that they should have ideally simultaneously also increased their capacity, infrastructural capacity, which didn't really happen. So this is where the IOE funding has come to their rescue, where they have been able to invest in new classrooms, new hostel rooms, faculty housing quarters. So a big chunk of that has gone into that. Interestingly, all of the institutions, research in India, by the way, is quite underfunded. I mean, if you look at their counterparts abroad, the amount of money that they get in terms of research grants, I mean, that's again much more complicated. The fact that they don't even get overheads, the institution doesn't get to keep any of the money. But that aside, a lot of them have invested, like if I can give IIT Bombay's example, that out of the 1,000 crore, they have earmarked 400 crore. It's not to say that they have spent 400 crore because they haven't received 1,000 crore yet, but they have earmarked 400 crore just to procure equipment, expensive equipment that they didn't have. And I was speaking with the deputy director and they said that, look, I know that this will not have an impact immediately, but our faculty now feels emboldened to take up more bold research projects, and that this will eventually see its impact or the difference this has made in about 10 years, based on our research productivity, which will improve considerably. So, in any way, the scheme is sort of halfway through. These institutions were meant to be monitored for 10 years. So, research essentially and infrastructural capacity enhancement is what I saw on the ground that has changed.
So, as far as the public institutions are concerned, they do seem to be benefiting from the funds of the scheme and the tag that comes along with it. But when we talk about private institutes, there is a lot of red tape that needs cutting through, so that these places can get the IOE tag as planned and the autonomy that they were promised.
I think that message needs to percolate through all levels of bureaucracy, and I don't know what it's going to take to change, because it's actually a shift in mentality, right? At least as far as the autonomy bit is concerned. I really don't know what it'll take to change that, to change the attitude and mindset of a bureaucrat sitting in a government department. A big part of the problem I personally felt was that, and just that, again, I don't really have an answer to how to address the red tapeism. The easy answer to that is just push that scheme through or just notify that committee. I don't really know why it hasn't happened. There are no clear answers for it. The government hasn't responded to our questionnaire. We asked the same question of the UGC and they said that, we're not responsible for notification of a committee. So even there, we didn't really have an answer. I know what needs to change, which is that there has to be a shift in mentality in order to let go of that control that they've had over public and private education institutions for years. And the government, frankly, just has to come good on its promise.
You were listening to 3 Things by The Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargava, and was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.